Hey everybody, and welcome to the S79 sewing studio. So today's video I'm going to show you how to let out a pair of suit trousers at the centre back seam. So the first thing you need to check when looking at doing this alteration is just make sure you have enough seam allowance in that centre back, and just make sure that they haven't already been altered and that this has been removed. Most suit trousers you do have a decent amount of seam allowance at the back. Okay, so the first thing you're going to need to do is undo the stitching along here that holds the waistband facing down. So taking a seam ripper, going to carefully unpick, and we're going to unpick a little bit further over than the actual seam allowance goes. So we're going to start about here. When you're unpicking, always unpick from the wrong side of the fabric, not the right side of the fabric. That way, any slight snags on the fabric is on the wrong side, not on the outside. And there we can see it's starting to come away from the waistband, and we can see the stitches there. And so there we are, we've unpicked this facing from the waistband at the centre back, and what you can see here now is that we have all this extra seam allowance. So by bringing the two seam allowances together, you can see where the seam goes down the centre back there. So if we open out these folded sections, keep this stitching in place, we're going to do a new line of stitching all the way down here. At this point, turn the trousers so that you can see the crutch. Okay, so with the original stitching still in place, I'm going to put some pins in here to hold this excess seam allowance where it should be. There we are. So we can see the original line of stitching, and it continues to run all the way down the crutch there. So I'm going to mark out, I need to let these out as much as possible. So we still want to make sure that there's a good centimetre seam allowance here, and actually they're not quite aligned, so I'm going to use the shorter piece and measure in 1 centimetre and put a mark. So 1 centimetre in, and I've put a mark, and I'm going to do this, so 1 centimetre from the shorter edge, just put a couple of marks. I'm using a Frixion pen. These disappear with the heat of the iron, and are great for marking areas where chalk wouldn't show up. So there we have a 1 centimetre seam allowance marked out all the way down the facing section. And now onto the actual fabric. I'm going to continue marking. I've got chalk this time, so it will show up. There we are. And now I need to blend this line all the way down so that it joins the line here of the original stitching. So to do that, I'm going to take a ruler, and this end, I'm not sure if you can see it, but this end is actually where the original stitching is, and this is where my mark is. So I'm just going to take this all the way down the straight centre back of the crotch seam. So you can see there, the new line of stitching is going to follow there. And just make sure that any curves are nice and smooth, and that everything's laying flat as it should be. So there you can see my new line, which will give us an extra 2 inches in the waistband, blended out into the centre back crutch seam. So I'm now going to stitch all the way along this seam. Because it's quite a key seam and we don't want this seam bursting open, I'm actually going to do 2 rows of stitching on top of each other. I'm still leaving the old stitching in place until I have done this stitching. It just keeps everything together and where it should be. So choosing a matching coloured thread in your sewing machine, start the stitching on top of the existing stitching at the lower end of the crutch seam. Start off with forwards and backwards to lock your stitch, stitching on top of the existing stitching until your line starts to come away, following your line all the way down. Just making sure everything's nice and smooth. We don't want things bunched up. Now, as you get to the parts where the facing is on top of each other, you want to make sure that this is on top of each other at the point at which your stitching is going to go over this. So just make sure that these are on top of each other exactly where they should be. We don't want them to be misaligned so that they're off like that. So we're just making sure they're on top of each other as we go all the way up, following the new line of stitching and making sure it's all nice and smooth. And at the top, a couple of forwards and backwards. Okay, so there we have the two seams. So it's now time to undo this stitch and just check all of our stitching lines up on the right side. At the bottom, where you've got your I'm not sure how well you can see this, but my existing stitches meet the old stitches. So I'm going to start a little bit further up. So you can see the mark, the chalk mark along this section here of my new stitching, and this is the old stitching. So we'll just cut that and just lift that out. There we are. So if you can get the run, you can actually unravel it and just carefully remove the back stitching. And the good thing about a chain stitch is that once you get it started, you can just pull on both threads and it all comes out, which is lovely. So with that done, we're just going to check that everything lines up as it should and that the turning point is where it should be and that the base of the waistband is where it should be. So next, I'm just going to run another row of stitches all the way down here just to strengthen this seam and make sure that it doesn't pop open should anybody bend down to pick something up. Okay, so we now have a duplicate row of stitches. Okay, so next we're going to press out this seam. So the new seam allowance needs to be pressed out, and we also want to flatten down the areas that were previously folded that are now going to be flat. So working from the wrong side to begin with, I'm going to press out the seam and just make that lay nice and flat. And then we can fold the facing to the inside, make sure it all lays nice and flat, and just press this down just to get this nice crease at the upper edge. There we are, and that's all lay nice and flat. So continue on down the crutch seam, opening it all out and just pressing that seam flat, seaming it. If you have a sleeve board, it's quite useful for just raising up that section there that we're working on. There we are. So the next thing to do is, if you remember when we first lifted this up, these seam allowance edges were folded up. So I'm just going to open this back up and turn these under, tucking away any loose threads. So turn that under. It just gives that nice point that we want to achieve. So just steam that down. So the last thing to do now is just to put back in the stitching to hold the facing down. So this needs to be done from the right side of the fabric. We need to put some stitching along this. It's called stitching in the ditch, and we're actually going to make sure our stitches go all the way along this seam line here. And what we're going to do with that stitching is anchor down this facing to hold it all exactly as it should be. So with the bobbin thread has now been changed to a cream, white or cream, to match this this facing colour, we can now start stitching. And I'm not stitching on top of the belt loop, but I'm starting my stitching really close to the belt loop. And making sure everything's nice and flat, start stitching. So we want to pull it apart as we stitch, and it will just allow the needle to slip in to that ditch of the seam and make sure everything lays nice and flat. Just make sure it's eased on nicely, and I'm stopping just before we get on top of this belt loop with a forwards and a backwards. And so there we are all done. So the facing is reattached, and the centre back seam has now been extended by 2 inches, which will give the wearer a bit more room around the waist. And so there we have it, a pair of trousers made larger at the waistband. So hopefully we'll get lots more wear out of these. Thank you for watching the video. I hope this has been of some use to you on your sewing journey. It's really important to me to be able to offer videos that are useful and beneficial to the sewing community. So if anybody has any suggestions or has a particular technique they'd like to learn, or a particular item they'd like to make, then please drop me a message in the comment, and I will do my best to try and cover some of those videos. Thanks so much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks very much. Bye.